Hello and welcome to today's EcoCiv dialogue on global systems change. I'm Andrew Schwartz, co-founder and executive vice president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization, director of the Center for Process Studies, and professor at Claremont School of Theology at Willamette University. I have the privilege of being the moderator for today's event. So EcoCiv convenes leaders and experts from around the world, and today's an example of that, leaders from all over the world. And we bring them together to discuss system solutions that address the root causes of our complex social and environmental challenges. And it's in that spirit that we've launched this dialogue series on global systems change. So today's panel of experts will be discussing systemic challenges around oppression, exclusion, exploitation, sort of generally, but also systemic racism specifically. With a constructive focus on building an ecological civilization from the foundations of equity, inclusion, and peace. So we have an absolutely stellar panel today. Joining us from South Africa is Ramphele. Mamphela is an activist, medical doctor, academic, businesswoman, political thinker. I think she called herself a pensioner. And she was a major figure in the anti-apartheid movement, the former managing director at the World Bank, now serves as co-president of the Club of Rome, where she continues to be a leading voice on socioeconomic issues in South Africa and around the world. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joining us the other side of the pond, from my perspective, in the UK is Nafeez Ahmed. Nafeez is an award-winning author and journalist. He's an academic, a change strategist who focuses on systemic nature of the world's most pressing global challenges. As an investigative journalist, Nafeez covers a wide range of topics, including the interconnections of global crises across climate, energy, food, money, terror, the police state, just to name a few. A former environmental blogger with The Guardian, Nafeez is also the founding editor and chief writer for the investigative journalism publication Insurge Intelligence, which I highly recommend. So Nafeez, thank you for joining us. All the way from Senegal is Muhammed Lamin Saidykhan. Muhammed Lamin is a Gambian human rights activist. He is coordinator of AfricansRising, which is a youth-led Pan-African grassroots movement for justice, peace, and dignity. He was instrumental in organizing widespread protest in 2017, which then led to Gambian dictator Yahya Jammeh's downfall, and he remains a leading voice at the intersection of social, economic, environmental, and gender justice across Africa. So it's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
Also from Africa, joining us from Uganda is Vanessa Nocatee. Vanessa is a fast-rising star, globally recognized climate justice activist. She's been a leading participant in the Friday for Futures protest, is the founder of Youth for Future Africa, which I understand later transformed into the Rise Up movement. Vanessa has campaigned for the Congo forest, and in December 2019, she was actually one of a handful of youth activists chosen to speak at the COP25 gathering in Spain. Very impressive. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you.
And joining us now from California, USA is Richard Rose. Richard is professor and chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophy, as well as program director for the Ecumenical Center for Black Church Studies at University of La Verne. He is a founding member of the Southern California Committee for a Parliament of the World's Religions and serves on its board of directors. Richard's also an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and is the assistant pastor at Christ Our Redeemer AME Church in Irvine, California. Richard, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So our format today is fairly simple. Roughly 30 minutes of panel discussion, followed by another 25 minutes or so of Q&A with our live audience. So if you have questions for our panelists, you can submit those in real time using the comments feature on Facebook Live, the Q&A feature on Zoom, or by tweeting your questions using hashtag EcoCiv. All right, so I'm gonna talk less, you're gonna talk more. Let's jump right in. So this dialogue series, it's about global systems change toward an ecological civilization. And by ecological civilization, I mean a world that prioritizes the well-being of people and planet over profit and power. I think that's something that most of you can get behind. But with that, there is an inherent recognition that the major challenges of our world are all interconnected. So I'm curious, in your experience, how do you see systems of racial oppression and exploitation relating or not relating to economic, educational, environmental, and other major world problems? Feel free to jump in, anyone.
I just want to start by saying that a world without racism is a world where we jettison this concept of racism and go back to what we know for sure scientifically. There's only one race, it's the human race. So if we want to be talking and focusing on systems change towards a civilization that promotes well-being of people and planet, we need to be clear about what it means to be people. Because Mother Nature, and I happen to be on a continent where all of us come from, in the human evolutionary process, what made us evolve into who we are today is because our ancestors were wise enough to understand that to be human is to be affirmed by other human beings as one, and to see yourself in them and them see you in themselves. But it went further than that. It was to understand that we are part of an ecosystem that is much wiser, much smarter than us, called nature. And as part of nature, we have much to learn from the way nature organizes itself. And that's why the ancient ancestors that we had understood how to just watch how nature works. That's how they got to harness the power of the Nile River for the Nubians and the Egyptians, Sudanese, and so on, to understand how to grow their food in harmony with nature's rhythms. And they had food in abundance. They also understood that there is wisdom in the stars. And by studying them, they got to understand a lot more. So I believe that what is missing in today's world civilization is, first of all, acknowledgement that there is only one human race. Second, acknowledgement of Africa's massive role, not only as a cradle of humanity, but the cradle of civilization. And third, we need to return to the source of wisdom, which is to acknowledge our being part of nature and learning from the system, the rhythms of nature. Because nature only takes what it needs, never more. And what's happening is that we've got multiple emergencies. We've got climate emergencies, we've got socioeconomic emergencies, now we've got COVID emergency, and there will be more. Because we are out of kilter, out of phase with the rhythms of nature. And COVID is an opportunity for us to ask the question, how do we return to a way of being human that will promote the well-being which COVID has made us acutely aware of how important it is to be well. because you can be how rich or how powerful. Once COVID gets to you, you really get to understand the importance of wellness. Now, we're not talking about occasional wellness, we're talking about holistic wellness. So I'm going to rest my comments for now.
Thank you.
I'd like to affirm what was just stated. I think it was stated beautifully. I really don't have much to add other than to say that I think the unrest that we are currently seeing, particularly addressing the issues of systematic racism here in the United States and other places of the world, might help to open up the kind of conversation that we need to have to begin to recognize the humanity of all of us. And that, I think, will move us in a better direction.
Nafeez.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Muhammed Lamin, yeah.
So add to that, I wanted to say that, you know, this world is created for us to live in harmony as people, but also live equally, to be able to survive with dignity. Every human being deserves a life with dignity. And then that's why the root cause of racism need to be dig into. We really need to reflect on the causes of racism, and then try to teach the young ones and educate the masses, especially the young people, to disease away from the effects or the dangers behind or beside racism. At AfricansRising, we started the whole process of, you know, reflecting back on where does it all start, and then try to see how do we address this particular challenge that the world is facing. It has been sparked recently by the killing of George Floyd in the US. And then we said, yeah, we can shout and make noise across the continent and diaspora about, you know, the challenges of racism. But it's important for us to reflect on where does it start. In our conclusion, we said that, you know, it all started from the scrambling of the resources that Africa has, that Black people had, by some selfish individuals that were leading leaderships in the West. When I talk about the scramble of African resources, I'm not talking about only the natural resources, but I'm also talking about even the human intellectual resources that Africa has. You know, our people have been taken, the resources have been taken at the same time. At the end of the day, what it caused is these people were subjected to discrimination, and that continued to nurture in the mindset of people. That's why I said the critical way of dealing with this is education. We really need to change the mindset of people to embrace each other, people to know that we are all human beings with equal values and deserve equal dignity to be able to survive in this world, to make the world a better place. The aspect of the scramble on Africa and the stolen of the world have also caused a lot of damage and challenges to the world in itself, in its ecological system as a world. It created industrialization where, you know, people will come from everywhere globally to come and grab these resources on the African continent, and then take these resources out of the continent to process them to create goods. And the aspect of processing these raw materials into goods that have been grabbed either forcefully or smartly from our people have created a big dilemma and a big challenge to our climate, our environment, and then the effects are more serious on the African continent, again, on our people, because when disasters hit us due to climate challenges, it kills us more. It wipes Africans out of their livelihood and completely. So what all of this is causing is that, people are seeing a green grass somewhere. In many communities in Africa, I'm based in West Africa, many of our young people have taken the dangerous routes to Europe because of the search for green grass. They are all going down there, taking this, the Mediterranean Sea, putting their lives at risk because the mega resources that we have on the African continent have been grabbed, have been taken out of the continent, have been processed out of the continent, and then it's providing resources and employment for those people. But it's also taking employment out of African continent because African continent depends on farming as livelihood. So when climate change, hit us due to the depletion of the layer by industrialization, what it does to African continent is taking the livelihood of farmers who are providing 70 to 80% of the food on the table. So eventually, it is taking all the green grass out of Africa, and then it's creating the green grass elsewhere. So people are forced to go for that green grass in order to survive. So the dignity of Africans actually is being stolen by industrialization. And then it's also been stolen by slave trade and then colonization that have not been restored yet. So we as citizens of this world really need to rethink and see how do we do development in order to ensure that, development is keeping us safe on this earth, or it's keeping us, alive on this earth. Because if we do not re-strategize our thinking and our approach to development, and then use the approach of green strategy by ensuring that, we are surviving without affecting the climate conditions or worsening the climate conditions, we will not be surviving on this earth. And then people are always saying that, oh, let's save the earth. But we are not going to save the earth. But we are not just going to lose the earth, but we are also going to lose ourselves as citizens of this world. So what this pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic, have also shown to the world is that we are all interdependent. Human beings living on this earth are interdependent, and when one is affected, the rest of human race will be affected. Because the way this virus is spreading, how fast the virus is spreading, is showing the world that we really need to address our issues, collectively. We really need to see human beings as equals. We really need to take solutions together in order to save ourselves, to live harmony in this world.
Vanessa, were you wanting to add something to that?
Yes, well, I personally think that if we want to put an end to the racism that we see in the different parts of the world, we need to tackle the root causes of the racism, because many times we focus on, if it's a tree, I would say we focus on the branches, we focus on the stems and actually leave out the root causes. I believe that the root cause of all the challenges that we see starts from way back, and that was the struggle for power, the greed for power, just as Mr. Muhammed has said. It all starts from the imperialism and the colonization that the African people faced. That is why we are here. And if we want to move ahead, we need to go back to that place that defined what race is dominant. We need to go back to that place that defined what race is of less value, and change all that thinking, because this thinking has been literally spread in every sector of life. Even in the education, the African students are being taught about how they are the minority race. They're being taught how they were dominated by much major races. So African children, they grow up with the thinking that we are the minor race, we are of less value. Yes, it may look like the colonization ended, but it actually continued in the minds of the people, and it's continuously being moved to the minds of the children through the education and all that is taught in the history of African people. I feel like the African continent is portrayed as one that is of less value. And starting from the fact that many people refer to it as a country is very disturbing. People need to, first of all, understand that the African continent is one with 54 countries, and every country has its own people. They need to acknowledge what Africa has. They need to acknowledge not the story that, you know, brought us to where we are. They need to acknowledge that Africa had great people and it still has great people. They need not to talk about the slaves that were taken to the Western countries. They need to talk about the human resources that were taken, that is the teachers that were taken, the doctors that were taken, all the intellectuals that were taken to, you know, those countries. As Mr. Muhammad has said, every resource was taken from the African continent. And then later on, we who came in as in the later maybe generation, we are made to feel like the African continent has nothing, and we have to depend on the continents that actually took everything away from Africa. So if we want to put an end to the racism that we see that is affecting every sector, including the environmental sector, because we understand that the African communities are those that are the most affected by the climate crisis. They are the ones with the least voices being heard. I mean, we just need a complete shattering of the system that actually determined which race is more dominant and which race is minor. We need to go back to a place whereby humanity was one and there was no difference, because at the end of the day, we are all the same regardless of who we are. We all carry blood within us. It is the same color. We all carry skeletons. There is nothing that separates us. And just as Mr. Muhammad has said, this COVID-19 pandemic has showed that pandemic knows no class, it knows no color, it knows no money, meaning that it affects everyone regardless of who you are. And that shows that we as human beings, we are connected in a way, we are all the same in a way. And if we want to thrive in this world happily and with everyone having access to what they need, we will need to work together as one. We will need to collaborate and try to live in this environment as one person. That is the only way that people will be able to live happily. That is the only way that we won't be able to see the racism that we are seeing right now.
Thank you. Nafeez, I want to get your take on this. You recently wrote an article I saw about how rampant white supremacism is connected to, I think you said, predatory socioeconomic order hell-bent on the destruction of others, a system which otherizes not just humans, but other species, and even the very natural environment in which we are irretrievably embedded yet blind to in every day. And I'm curious on how you, I mean, we talk about the underlying causes of racism. We talk about, I mean, is otherizing one of those causes? And what, I mean, how do we address those sort of systems of otherizing?
Yeah, so yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to my colleagues for all their thoughtful comments on this issue. And I think I have to say that they've set, the groundwork's been set very clearly with the thread of needing to go back to understand historical origins of where we are today. And it's only by understanding the historical context that we can begin to see the structures of our system and how it operates. And when we do that, when I wrote this piece, White Supremacism in the Earth System, I was struck by a number of things when I put it together. And I think the intersection of colonization with ecological catastrophe is something which really came to light with a particular journal paper in Science, the Science Journal, the very prestigious, well-known journal. And this was an article by two British geographers, Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin. And this really hit it home for me, because what they did is they wanted to understand the concept of the Anthropocene. Obviously, the Anthropocene is, it's a contested term, and it talks about the new geological epoch that we are now inhabiting. Not everyone agrees with it, but it's this idea that humanity has now had this indelible impact on the geology of the earth, which requires coming up with this whole new way of aging our current time, distinctive to previous geological epochs. And one of the arguments was that you can actually detect when humanity had its first really huge geological impact in the Antarctic ice cores from 1610. And they said 1610, you can detect this massive kind of reduction in CO2 in the atmosphere. And they said this seems to be linked to the fact that shortly before then, the Native Americans were basically wiped out in the context of the colonization that had begun with Christopher Columbus's arrival on the continent from Spain. And in that ensuing process, after the civilizations collapsed, there was a vast regrowth on the kind of underdeveloped farmlands and so on across the continent, which explains why so much carbon dioxide was taken out of the atmosphere in a way that was detectable in the ice cores. And this is, of course, a really kind of like quite shocking intersection, because it shows how, we had this number of different things happening. One, we had the expansion of European civilization. We had this kind of biological encounter, a biological ecological encounter in the Americas, which involved, of course, the spread of European diseases, but it also involved missionary activities, colonial enterprises, and all sorts of complex things, which ultimately led Native Americans to have their entire, quite complex civilizations effectively wiped out. And in the wake of that, we began to see that discourses about power and people were changing and evolving. And I think this really took on something like, 9 years after 1610, we have another pivotal date, which is the arrival of the first African slaves on a British ship in the port of Virginia. And from there on, of course, we have several hundred years of the transatlantic slave trade, where tens of millions of Africans were transported systematically to the Americas in order to fuel the acceleration of colonial enterprises. And this, to me, is really critical, because when we start looking at the explosion of the transatlantic slave trade, the massive exponential growth of economic enterprises, how this fed into the British Industrial Revolution, which occurred, in the 18th century, and the emergence of around the same time of, what you might call scientific racism, which is when, we had the kind of misappropriation of neo-Darwinistic theories applied within a social and civilizational context, and you had the construction of, this hierarchy of races with, Europeans at the top. And all of this was used to kind of justify and make sense of this expanding imperial system, which, absorbed many different countries and regions into it as we went along and as it grew. But so clearly we begin to see that all of this nexus that we have, because obviously the Industrial Revolution then triggered the explosion of dependence on fossil fuels. And once we moved into the fossil fuel age, this further kind of opened up massive new avenues of exponential growth. And here we are today. We have exponential growth in carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. And we have kind of globalization and all sorts of things. So I think looking at that history for me was really, really eye-opening, because it really kind of underscored how these things are not separate. And I think the problem we have at the moment is we tend to look at these things in a silo. We've got the climate activists looking at climate change. We've got, the civil rights activists looking at the race issues, and you maybe have foreign policy people worrying about foreign wars and all the rest of it, but we're not really looking at how these different pieces are really part of the same puzzle, and they, in a way, just different lenses on a predatory system which has been expanding. And I think at the core of that system is this idea of, I mean, and that's probably an oversimplification, but it's this way of kind of otherizing different groups or species or the planet itself in order to expropriate resources for a particular purpose. And of course, it's captured within an ideology. There's a very specific set of ways of being and doing and living which are bound up with all of this. I think what we're now starting to see is that all of this is falling apart. We've had, when we look at the pandemic and we look at the Black Lives Matter protests, and we look at the context of the financial crash in 2008, and the Arab Spring uprisings and the Occupy movement, and what we're starting to see is that really these things were not really separate. They're kind of these periodic eruptions as this system kind of moves into this space of accelerating crisis. And it is going to keep accelerating, and the pandemic is really only the latest episode in this. But it really kind of, I think it's important for us to realize that, and I think as Vanessa said, the colonization hasn't really finished. What we've seen is a recalibration of the system. It's an adaptation and a recalibration. We saw capitalism change. We saw with the abolition of the slave trade, there's a lot of literature about how this wasn't, of course there was a moral movement. There were people who were appalled and that had a role. But we cannot discount the fact that ultimately the inefficiencies and the costs of the colonial enterprises and the logic of capitalism as it was emerging also played this crucial role in saying, well, actually, this isn't really serving the interests that we had in place. We need to shift to a more efficient system. And a more efficient system means that we actually allow some people to, we allow some people to have rights because we want them to play a different role in the workforce. And recalibrating the workforce, but that didn't mean that oppression disappeared. It meant that it became, in some ways, it became more invisible, and baked into the system in different ways. And I think that's what we're dealing with now, is this sense of denial, this idea, oh, racism is finished, racism doesn't exist anymore, or we've done with most of the bad racism. But actually what's happened is kind of become a lot more insidious, difficult to detect because it exists. It's people will say, well, I don't believe in biological racism. But instead of believing in biological racism, you may live and carry and walk around in structures and systems which embed racist practices and ways of being in ways that we don't always see. And I think that's the challenge, is how do you, it's not so much anymore about, oh, what do you believe? It's really about challenging and questioning our place within these wider systems and how they work, and seeing how they work and owning that, taking ownership for that.
So building off of that, how, I'm looking for the how-to strategies, right? When you all are experts on this, how do we begin to transition away from an exploitative system to one that's built on the foundations of equity, inclusion, and peace? What does it even mean to tear down these structures of oppression? How does this happen? Is it through top-down policies? Is it through grassroots movements, new narratives and alternative paradigms, some combination of these, or just something else entirely? Mamphela, I see your hand. You're muted though.
I also want to jump in.
Unmute.
We need to acknowledge that the root cause of racism is to justify and perpetuate this exploitative system. And I live in a country and a continent where we have had decolonization and power passing to African leaders, but the racism is embedded in the mindsets of both the exploited and those who brought in this system. And it's so deeply embedded that we become our own worst enemies. And so when you talk about the how, I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is that the most powerful weapon of racists is the mindset of the exploited. And in South Africa, it was you could actually touch it, because not only were we denied rights and whatever, we denied ourselves those rights. We called ourselves non-whites, non-Europeans. That's how deeply colonized our minds were. And this is why, as student leaders in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, the only way we got the sleepy liberation movement to wake up is when we woke up, that until your mind is liberated, liberation in terms of the paperwork that changes doesn't change anything. As you have seen, the structures are still the same, like the colonials left them. The education system is still the same. The mindset, even in parliament, people still wear those funny wigs in courts and so on. So we have embraced the colonial culture right deep. And the worst thing is that we don't even teach ancient African culture. The way you have explained it, Nazim, Nafeez, the way you have explained it, very few university professors who are Africans understand that. And now if people who are supposedly the intellectuals don't actually have a grasp of what it is that we're dealing with, then we have very little chance. And in South Africa, the way we look at it, and I think it is universal, that the 1994 end of apartheid was simply the signing of papers. We did not move to the next stage, which is take off the mindset. And yet in our constitution, we wrote that we are going to heal the wounds of that past, because racism humiliates, and that multi-generational humiliation is what gets us to humiliate ourselves. The way our leaders will be hitting people with shamboks in the streets, their own mothers and grandmothers, because they've embraced that thing. So we need to unlearn, and that's a very deep and very challenging process of mindset shift. We need to embrace a new set of values. We talk Ubuntu, human-centeredness, but we don't live it. Because what we live is what we have been inculcated into. And so at the Club of Rome, we are talking about the need for a new civilization. We need to acknowledge that the planetary emergencies that we've got, we can deal with COVID, we can deal with climate, but if we don't rethink the entire system and embrace a new value system that puts value on life primarily, or that challenges the idea that the only way you can develop is through a capitalist system that exploits other people. We believe economics is about the exchange of goods and services, and it can be done in a way that promotes well-being. And the financialization of economics and development is the real crux, because the people who own those financial institutions and the instruments they've created, they're just rentiers. They're sitting there and, Wall Street JSC, wherever, London, they just make money sitting. The more you have, the more you get. So unless we jettison that entire, rethink the entire finance system, we always are going to be in this mess. And so my continent is in trouble because our leaders, including the leaders of South Africa, think that they can develop South Africa by continuing with the socio-economic system that they inherited from apartheid, that has been reinforced by the Washington Consensus. We need a new way of looking at development as a process of promoting well-being of people and the planet.
Andrew, if I may, I would like to say I'm hopeful at this moment. I think the session itself has been wonderful. It's been very informative. The moment that we are dealing with in time across the world, as we talk about dismantling institutional racism, if we can teach what has been presented here in terms of the reasons for institutional racism, we can create an opportunity to teach those values that are traditional African values that talk about Ubuntu and our humanness and so forth. And so we have an opportunity right now, I think, to teach a new way of being interconnected on the planet. One of the things that I have noticed in recent months is a desire to return back to rites of passages programs here in the Americas. I'm working with several organizations that are seeking to provide rites of passages for our young people everywhere from middle school on up. In fact, some of the programs are working with elementary school children. And so it's an opportunity to re-engage the Pan-African movement. One of the things that we here in America don't realize, African Americans, is the connection that we have with the Pan-African movement. This conversation here has allowed me to speak to persons around the globe that I hope to continue conversation with. So I think that as we begin to help African Americans here in the United States realize that we are not a minority, we are actually a part of a majority here on the planet, that will give us a certain level of self-confidence in ourselves to begin moving in such a way that we can attack issues of racism in a way that we haven't before. And so I'm hopeful in this particular moment.
Yeah, Andrew, if I will add just few, I know we don't have much time, but just to add few points to saying that I think this whole, I see a lot of great hope. I see a lot of great hope in the youths. And I see a lot of great hope in the awareness of our people, especially the organizing level at the grassroots level of movements that are coming up, challenging these unjust systems that have been installed by colonial masters that have, traditionalized and institutionalized racism in all aspects. So I see a lot of hope in popular education. When we invest in popular education and educating to change the mindset, as Mamphela said, we really need to live what we preach. The spirit of Ubuntu, in our forefathers' time, when we listen to the stories that they will tell us, they supported each other. When one house is burned down by a fire, the rest of the communities will not sleep until that house is put up. So, they live as, as human beings, not like based on color. So that based on colors or differences. But, the aspect of capitalism, the system of capitalism have dismantled all the different interconnections and cultures and systems that we have and the values that we have. And we really need to go back to that drawing board and then, continue that popular education. One thing that is clear is that the leadership of this world listen to, based on my experience and my engagement with leadership, and then holding them accountable that's my life, is that they listen to two languages. One language that they listen to is numbers. So as my brother is saying, Richard, we as citizens of people of color really need to be connected. We really need to see that, we have a voice, but we need to connect our struggles together. We really need to be in communication so that we can raise bigger voices around issues that are affecting us. When we don't do that, they will not listen to us. And then right now, the moment is here for us to work together and end these injustices now. The other thing that, that they listen to more is the visibility of issues. And the visibility of issues is given to us by media. We really need to, take charge and then, embrace media and then use media effectively. Social media, becoming an opportunity for us to organize and then be able to communicate strongly and effectively the challenges that we are faced with. So I think the grassroots movements are coming together with the effective use of media. We'll be able to win this fight against racism, and then we can build a world without racism.
This is great. Nafeez, as a journalist and a change strategist, what do you see as the role of new narratives in decolonizing mindsets, transforming public perception and values, all the things that we've been talking about, therefore transforming the systems and structures of our modern industrial civilization?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I've got the answer to that, but definitely, it's clear that we need a new narrative, right? What we're starting to see is that the old stories are broken in so many different ways, and fundamentally, they're not even true. They don't work. They're dysfunctional. So this need to move into a new story is absolutely critical. And but you can't do that without acknowledging what's happened in the past to some extent and owning that. And I think there is this, the debate. There's a question here about someone saying, there seems to be a debate between seeing color and knowing no color. Do we accept, appreciate, and celebrate our differences, or consider us all Homo sapiens and simply rely on content of our character? This is an interesting question because it poses these as a binary thing, and it's like the idea, do we, what's the clash? Is there a clash between recognizing difference and, this kind of idea of color blindness? And I think what a lot of us, who are people of color, are trying to say is that we're not, you can't just say, I don't see color, and use that as a way of saying I'm not racist. Like, I get that. We all understand that. We understand the value of that. We understand the need for us to recognize our humanness. But there is a reality out there, and that reality is that there is structural and institutional racism and other forms of more direct racism, which do exist. You can't tackle that by pretending that you can't see anything. You have to have discernment. And I think that's the balance between realizing that I want to be able to see someone's humanness, despite also recognizing that there is in this system that I'm existing in a hierarchy, which may discriminate against people of color in ways that I might not experience in the same way, and therefore I need to have a degree of discernment about that. And having that discernment doesn't take away from the need to to kind of accept that we are all equal and we're all human and we're all Homo sapiens. Far from it. In fact, it empowers you to be able to cut through those systems in that discernment. And I think that's the really important thing. I think that's what the that's why it's so frustrating when you have the Black Lives Matter protest, and then you've got kind of the All Lives Matter response. And it's like, people who are saying Black Lives Matter, why do you hear that as a cancellation of your life? It's kind of absurd. It's like Black Lives Matter does not cancel all lives mattering. It simply states, because there's something obvious that should be obvious, but that is sadly not embedded in our systems, that Black lives currently in our systems don't matter. They are brutally violated on a systematic way, in a vast scale, not just within the West, but also within the global system. When we look at, for example, the inherent racism in the World Bank's poverty measures, let's measure poverty by this standard of $1.25 a day. This is not a standard that we're going to apply within the West. for some reason, but somehow in the developing world, this standard has a meaning, and we apply it, and it means that these people are not in poverty. It's absurd. But again, so these things are a function of, you know, these forms of racism, which, you know, I don't know if anyone, you know, did someone sit there and say, I'm going to be racist about poverty statistics? No, this was a result of institutions. It was a result of power dynamics. It's a result of that blindness that we can't see what's going on. So I think that's what we need to retrieve in the people who are in these institutions need to be able to take ownership. And I think what's encouraging, and I think it is encouraging, is that since the protests have erupted across the United States, there has been, you know, there's obviously been, there has been hand waving, and there's been the usual kind of platitudes and, oh, we're not racist, blah, 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 blah. But at the same time, there has been a lot of soul searching going on across all levels of society. And I think that's been kind of reflected in some of the opinion polling that's been done recently, that's shown that I think if you went back a couple of decades, the polling showed that most Americans would have said, you know, we don't believe that America has a problem with racism. Whereas now, I think it's a slim majority now accept that there is a real problem with institutional racism in the United States. That's a sea change. And that's a direct result of these protests ongoing, hitting, and people seeing the clash with existing structures. They're, you know, seeing the brutalized policing that's going on. And they're starting to ask questions, and they're waking up. So there is this awakening, and there is now an opportunity, as that old system is crumbling. There's this unprecedented opportunity to weave this new story of inclusion, but it's one that requires taking ownership for the challenges and the problems that we face. And I think there are lots of concrete things that need to be done, but one of the most important things is having those conversations which allow us to take responsibility for where we are. And once we've taken that responsibility, we're able to say, okay, now how do we now step into this new story? And what are the concrete things we need to do as institutions to change those policies? And it's, you know, there's a huge scale of things that need to be done across public health, across you know, economic policy, across employment, across education. There's so much to do, but I think it really does begin with individuals in different positions at different scales, kind of taking on that change and saying, wow, I'm seeing this, and I need to move into another space. But that really does also mean learning from, you know, Black communities, you know, learning from from Black institutions, learning from elders and leaders who have been saying this for decades, you know, and not being heard, and finally saying with, you know, humility, okay, we need to listen, we need to learn and listen, and then we can move forward.
I'd like to get Vanessa in on the conversation real quick.
She's not there. I don't know what's happened to her.
I just want to add something towards what you asked. I'm sorry, my video is off. I'm not feeling so well. In regards to the question that you asked, I just really want to mention like 2 points. One is education and policing, because I feel like if people are to change their mindset, then they need to first unlearn what was taught. They need to unlearn everything that has been taught from the beginning. And that starts from the education systems, because the person's mindset, the person may choose to change their mindset on who they really are, and not what another person determines them to be. But then they go back to school, and then the education system puts them back in the very thing they're trying to get away from. So I think that people need to first unlearn what has been taught. They need to unlearn everything about what they were told they were. Because in my country, of course, I see the young kids, I see students, every time they see maybe a white person, they get so excited. It's like they've seen a god or something of that sort. And it's really disturbing, because this has been put into their minds from home, from school. So we need to help the students, we need to help the children and the rest of the people unlearn what has been taught at home, unlearn what has been taught in schools. And then we need to bring in the education that they really need to know, understanding more of their African culture, understanding more of the, the powerful people from the African continent and getting inspired by them, learning from them, because it should not be a surprise to a student in Africa when they find out that maybe an African person is a congresswoman somewhere, maybe in the United States, something of that sort. So it shouldn't be surprising to us anymore. We need to put it in the students that you are not the minor race. We are all the same regardless of who we are. And then the issue of policing. Policing, of course, contributes a lot to the structural racism that we see, the institutional racism that we see. Because if you look at the blueprints of most of these institutions, the blueprints of organizations, the blueprints of the systems, in a way, there is a way they have privilege, white privilege, and then there is a form of oppression to the African people or to the people from the global south. So we need to also look at the policing in these organizations. What are the blueprints of your organization? What are the blueprints of your company? What are the blueprints? What does it stand on? Does it promote equality for all the people, or it's actually pushing for dominance of one race and then pushing more of a lesser value for another race? Because I've seen that so much. You find that there are companies whereby you cannot find an African executive officer, I think CEO. There are companies where you cannot find an African as a chief executive officer, or you cannot really find, if it's a board of directors, you would find that there could be only 2 people representing the African continent and the rest are being dominated. So it all goes back to the systems that we are in and how the policies and how the blueprints need to change. Because even in the climate movement, when I go for maybe climate conferences, there is still an imbalance. There is underrepresentation of the people from the African continent. You find that there are so many of the Western countries activists and less of the African. It's more like they just pick out who they really want to invite, maybe because it sells news for them, They choose out who they want to interview. Because one of the conferences that I've attended, it was in Davos. I was the only African activist on the press conference, and that was already disturbing, the fact that I was the only African activist and the rest of the activists were from Europe. I felt that was an underrepresentation because the African people have been speaking for a long time. They have been demanding for action for a long time. It's just that their stories hadn't been amplified, their voices hadn't been amplified. And then for the press conference to go on and later on to find out that I've been cropped out of the photo, it showed that a certain kind of white supremacy that is being promoted, that is being pushed. Because I've been in school and of course I was taught something that I'm trying to unlearn, that I come from a minor race. And then when something like that is done, it's more like a stamp or to a certificate to make it more valid. So it was more like a stamp or the icing on the cake to actually let me know that, yes, what you've been thinking, what you've been taught is actually who you are. You are of less value, you come from a minor race. And I think this really needs to change. We need to help each other and learn what was taught, but then we also need to change the policies. We need to change the blueprints of these institutions that are continuously pushing racism. And as Mr. Nafeez said, he said that yes, it seems like colonialism ended, but it actually it's more like sugar courted colonialism, I would say. It looks like it isn't there, but it's actually there. It's just that it is less visible, and people actually don't notice it. Even in our own countries, we see it in restaurants, in hotels. So you find that even your own people, they don't value you the same way that they value maybe tourists from other countries. So we need to first help them unlearn, and they know who they are, they know their identity, they know their nature. And when that is done, when they have understood how powerful the African culture is, how powerful the African continent is, then we move to changing the policies. We need to change, we move to changing the systems. And I would also like to talk about the grassroots movements that are protesting and, demanding for action. I believe that they are helping many people realize who they really are, because many times people just rather stay silent about the racism that they experience, because as much as I got a lot of support after the crop from the photo, there were still people who were saying, that was something small, you would have just kept quiet. I mean, I feel like enough of us tolerating all this, because it's the norm of the world, because it's the norm of the society. We need to actually challenge these people. We need to challenge their spaces, and they need to realize that this is not who you told us we are. We have actually realized the kind of people that we are. We are important. We are from the African continent, and we are proud of that. Regardless of who you think we are, that doesn't matter. I know who I think I am, and that is what really matters. And I think it should be the mindset of every person who feels like they experience racism in a way from their countries, or when they go to other countries. You first know who you really are, and that is what you present. And do not be intimidated by anyone, and do not let anyone define your personality. Don't let anyone define who you are. Don't let anyone define where you fall in society. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. We could go on, I think, for several more hours with all the amazing insights that you all have. As we wrap up, I'm curious, we've talked a lot about these really complex and serious problems. We've talked about the kinds of things we need to do to decolonize our mindsets, our systems, and our structures, and to try to create a new civilization. That's a big job. So given the situation at hand and given the path before us, is there reason to have hope? I know, Richard, you'd already mentioned that you have some hope, but I'm curious about the rest of you. Mamphela.
Yeah, the reason I'm still active at 73 is because I know for sure that this too shall come to an end. But for that end to come, it requires more than just mindset change. Because when someone says, I don't see color, and they're sitting in Lower Hudson, and someone is sitting in a slum in Cape Town, that person sees this. So, and I think the issue of blind spots, Nafeez talked about blind spots. There are blind spots and blind spots. People choose to be blind. It's like the $1.5 as or $1.25 as a marker of poverty or not poverty. They choose that because they don't think that the people that they're talking about are like them. They have the same aspirations as them and so on. And so I speak passionately about the structural side of it because I live in a country with a constitution that says we are equal, we are the same, but my government is promoting an inequitable system and they're making hay out of it. The corruption that we have in our government is because people don't want to disturb the existing structures because they're enjoying them. They want to have the ministerial cars and the cars and whatever, rather than say, we want to restore the dignity of every person by dismantling the structures. In our cities, if you are white and wealthy, you are likely to be living in a real lovely part of town. If you are Black and poor, you are out in the outskirts. This is not happening because of colonialists who are here doing this. We have embraced the continuation of this inequitable structure. So I really agree with Nafeez's point that we need to acknowledge this history, not just we as the people who have been on the receiving end, but the people who are wealthy beyond measure must acknowledge that they got wealthy because of this inequitable system, and therefore they must be part of the solution to end socioeconomic inequity.
Final remarks from the rest of you before we conclude.
Andrew, the only thing I would like to add just in terms of the hope that I have is, and what I tell my students is, don't be overwhelmed by the number of challenges that we have before us. Find your gift, find your niche, find the area where you feel comfortable working. And in so doing, you will find that there are others working in that area as well. You'll find collaboration and you'll be able to see some rewards from the work that you are doing. And I find that when students do that, they can actually be re-energized in terms of what they are seeking to do in this larger, in this larger problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that as we wrap up, it's sad that racism have been institutionalized not only by the colonial masters, but it have been carried on by even our governments, our current governments. As we talk now, about 2 of the activists have been arrested or going to court because of organizing a solidarity protest with the Black Lives Matter movements on the African continent. Fighting against systemic racism. I wanted to just say that, it's time for us to uproot this dangerous element out of the systems, but also out of the mindset of the people. We must do this not only through recognizing or educating, but also to take action. We must take action together, collectively, to be able to end racism. And then also we must hold the powers accountable. And then people who have also been stealing from the minorities, we must hold them accountable to ensure that we are able to build an equitable wall, and a wall that have that embrace dignity for all human race.
Nafeez, closing thoughts?
I would echo the advice of Richard about the how to respond in a really constructive way. Sometimes it can feel very overwhelming when you're looking at this convergence of events. And there's really 2 things I would add. One is it's really important to understand that the reason there is a convergence and an overwhelming convergence of events is not just because, oh yes, everything is bad, but because actually it's all kind of coming together. And there is a very real systemic transition that we are experiencing. And there are a number of scientific frameworks and studies and systems approaches which are attempting to understand this, but are throwing light on the fact that there is a huge amount of evidence really that supports this idea that really what we're now experiencing is a kind of a big global level phase shift within the existing system, which means that many old structures, including the energy system, including the kind of this endless growth, economic dynamic, et cetera, the structures of racism, that all of these systems are basically part of an overarching civilizational structure that is ultimately failing. It's coming up against its own internal dysfunction, and it's coming up against planetary boundaries, and we cannot continue on this path. And that's why it's all coming up. You know, we're going through that process where you need to experience that darkness, and you need to go into it in order to come out the other side. You know, like you need to, it's almost like a grand form of civilizational therapy. We're not going to deal with this until we confront and deal with and address all of these things. So I think that's the really one important thing that I would say. I guess the second thing I would add is that it is really important when you're looking at these big things to recognize that it's not on each of us as individuals to change the entire world. It's on us to change where we have leverage. And that's where it really is on us. And I think that's what, as individuals, we need to ask ourselves. And that is, you know, where am I in this process, and what can I actually do tangibly in myself, in my community, in my family. Those are the really tangible arenas of action which are available to us. And system change begins at that level, you know, where each of us as individuals, as cells, as nodes within a system are scaling our own forms of change in those small scale contexts. And the idea is that all of us doing this eventually cascades and can force change from the bottom up. So it's really, there is a lot of hope, there's a lot of opportunity. So it's important to remember that really actually we're at an unprecedented moment of huge opportunity which has never been seen before.
And with those amazing words, I want to thank you all for being here. This has been a fantastic conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground, but at the same time, I feel like we're only scratching the surface. So I'm hoping we can have more conversations like this in the near future. The video of today's conversation will be available on Facebook momentarily, and then will be uploaded to the EcoCiv YouTube channel a little later. For more information on events like this one, be sure to follow EcoCiv on social media. And if you have suggestions for topics or panelists that should be a part of this EcoCiv Dialogues on Global Systems Change series, please send us your ideas. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us. An amazing panel. Have a great day.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.